1415 before them. After we have concluded our expedited consideration, I would be glad to recognize any member, including myself and the ranking member, or Dr. Barra, if he serves. I think you're serving in that position right now, right? For any statements they might have on the issue. All members are given leave to insert written remarks into the record if they so choose. Seeing again that we have a reporting quorum present, without objection to H.R. 1415, the End Tropical Diseases Act, Title I only, is considered as read. The chair moves that it be adopted. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. The ayes have it. In the opinion of the chair, the item is adopted. Without objection, the measure is reported favorably to the full committee, and the staff is directed to make any technical and conforming changes. I would just say a few opening comments on this legislation, and we'll put in a much fuller statement for the record. Neglected tropical disease, and let me just say for the record too, this is the second Congress that we're trying to get this legislation passed. We got it out of full committee last year. Regrettably, it stalled in the Energy and Commerce Committee, but my hope is that that will not be the case this year. Neglected tropical diseases are a group of 17 parasitic and bacterial diseases which blind, thank you, Jim, disable, disfigure, and sometimes kill victims from among the more than 1 billion of the world's poorest people, trapping the most marginalized communities into a cycle of poverty. These diseases can keep children from attending school and their parents from working, and cause excessive bleeding by mothers during birth, and results often in low birth weight babies. NTDs therefore constitute a significant hurdle to achieving economic growth and dilute the impact of foreign assistance programs. While tropical diseases primarily affect communities in developing countries, outbreaks have been reported in the United States and other developing countries in recent years, such as the West Nile virus, dengue fever, and most recently, Zika. The most common NTDs can be controlled and eliminated. However, there is still much work to be done to prepare for currently unknown diseases that may appear on the international scene and to reach the World Health Organization's control and elimination goals by 2020. To achieve these goals, heightened support is needed now from both new and longstanding partners. H.R. 1415 supports the control and elimination of NTDs in the United States by, among other things, supporting USAID's NTD program to better integrate NTD control and elimination efforts with other development issues such as HIV/AIDS, malaria, water and sanitation, and education, and conduct research and development for improved drugs, diagnostics, and vaccines to control or to eliminate STDs. Directing the U.S. government to advocate for increased efforts to address NTDs among international institutions such as the UN, WHO, and the World Bank. Calling for the Department of Health and Human Services to submit a report on NTDs in the U.S. to better understand the epidemiology, impact, and appropriate funding needed to address NTDs domestically, encouraging the creation of one or more NTD centers of excellence. I would note parenthetically that in the year 2000, I authored legislation on the issue of autism, and the mainstay of the legislation was a series of those centers of excellence. And those centers of excellence and the work that now CDC and NIH does on autism has resulted in a major push to try to help those with autism discover root causes and to promote early childhood intervention, and it came out of those centers of excellence. So this could be a game changer, we think, in a game that has to be changed for the sake of the poor and marginalized communities. It also would establish a panel on intestinal worm infections to evaluate and make recommendations regarding potential solutions to worm infections, which impact more than 1 billion people worldwide, including 600 million school-aged children. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson told the Foreign Affairs Committee full committee yesterday that the administration was committed to remaining a leader in areas including global health. They can demonstrate that commitment by continuing to support the work done by CDC, and the National Institutes of Health and the U.S. Agency for International Development. And I do believe that as we move forward on that budget, those gaping cuts will not materialize, and I know I and others will work hard to ensure that we do more in some cases rather than less. It is long past time for Congress to affirm this work, particularly in the area of NTDs. And I want to thank Ranking Member Bass, Congressman Dan Donovan, Gregory Meek, Sanford Bishop, and Eleanor Holmes Norton for joining us as early co-sponsors of this legislation. And I'd like to yield to Dr. Barra if he has any comments he'd like to make.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll keep my comments brief, but I think this is an important piece of legislation. I look at this as a physician who has worked overseas, and we don't always think about neglected tropical diseases. The folks sitting around the table at home may not be talking about schistosomiasis or trachoma, but the truth is these are diseases that affect millions around the world, and the reason why investing in this research, looking for cures are so important. It's a reflection of not only our values as a nation to engage with our allies and other like valued countries around the world to relieve suffering. We also know that the world is much more interconnected today. Diseases that emerged, much like Ebola a few years ago or Zika in one part of the world certainly move and spread. So we can't just think about how we address health and disease here in the United States. We've also got to go where those diseases are and look for those discoveries. So, it is my hope that this moves quickly through the full committee and to the floor of the House. And again, it is a reflection of who we are as the nation and our values to be concerned and focus on that suffering around the world. So, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to take a moment to thank you for your leadership in this area. I mean, global health has become a great interest of mine since I got here 2 years ago. We deal daily with the preventable diseases throughout the world that, as Dr. Barra says, we're a compassionate leading nation. We outsource our abilities to help others, as you also mentioned, because of the ability for people to travel. Many diseases that may not affect our nation now because people traveling to our country affect us as well. But through our compassion and leadership, this nation should you do everything it can to relieve other countries of diseases that are preventable and non-existent in our own country. You have been a leader in this area for so many, many years. I just want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank my colleagues for supporting this legislation.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Suarez?
Associate my remarks with everything that's been said already, and thank you for your leadership. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Mr. Garrett?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Very briefly, I think budget hawks might look at this and wonder what the purview was of this organization as it relates to this action. I would answer them by saying that it's difficult, if not impossible, to separate global health from American health. That in a world with intercontinental travel, in a world that shrinks by the day, conceptually, the idea to combat these NTDs abroad rather than at home might parallel the hawkish line that some take in the war on terror. I would associate my remarks with the gamut of individuals on this committee and submit that while it's not just being a good neighbor, it's also being a good tenant in our own home, and this is good policy at every level. Thank you.
Mr. Garrett, thank you so very much. Thanks to all the members of the subcommittee for their support and their excellent remarks. Without further ado, the markup is concluded, and we will now move to the hearing that was scheduled pursuant to notice. This hearing will come to order, and I want to thank again my colleagues for being here, and I want to thank our distinguished witnesses for not only being here and their extraordinary expertise, but also for their flexibility. We moved yesterday's hearing to today and markup, as you know, because of the tragic circumstances surrounding the assault on Steve Scalise, two members of the Capitol Police, and of course a member of the congressional staff who are wounded. So I want to thank you for your indulgence and patience for that. I'd like to say a few opening remarks, and I'll yield to my colleagues for any comments they might have. The Bible in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 2 tells us that there is a time to plant and there's a time to harvest. That ancient sage prescription has allowed multitudes to be fed over the course of humankind, but now ruthless men seeking power have disrupted this cycle, causing man-made famines where none should exist in African countries from South Sudan to Nigeria to Somalia. Famine in Africa and Yemen have been called the worst since World War II. even worse than the catastrophic 2011 famine in East Africa. What makes this round of famine even more tragic is how preventable it is. For example, South Sudan contains, the most arable land and was once a united Sudan. Aside from oil reserves, agriculture was seen as the key to South Sudan's future success. Now areas of the Equatorial provinces, South Sudan's breadbasket, are engulfed in conflict, with citizens fleeing the country in the thousands daily. There are now more than 4.8 million displaced South Sudanese, 1.8 million refugees in neighboring countries, over 900 million of those are in Uganda alone, and at least 2 million internally displaced persons. South Sudan is experiencing heightened levels of food insecurity, with as high as 27% of the population in some areas facing famine. Despite the government's contention that people are merely being frightened by rumors of conflict, South Sudan has quickly surpassed Eritrea to become the world's fastest emptying country. Another country seeing a major exodus due to conflict is Somalia. There are an estimated 881,000 Somali refugees, and the anticipated scale of population displacement from Somalia due to pervasive conflict and the threat of starvation will increase refugee flows throughout the region and into Europe. In Somalia, nearly 6.2 million people are currently in need of humanitarian assistance, and more than 2.9 million people are facing crisis or emergency levels of acute food insecurity, including nearly 1 million children under the age of 5. Nigeria is yet another country experiencing famine due to conflict. There are 14 million people in northeast Nigeria who are in urgent need of humanitarian assistance, including more than 8 million children, and almost 6 million people are also facing food insecurity. About 9 million Nigerians are projected to suffer from food security by August of 2017, including more than 3 million people living in the northeast state of Borno. We focus on the part Boko Haram has played in creating chaos and famine in Nigeria, and quite rightly so. More than 30,000 lives have been lost in violence related to Nigeria's Boko Haram insurgency. But there is a developing threat that could widen the likelihood of food insecurity there. Attacks by Fulani extremists on farmers in Nigeria's Middle Belt are increasing in intensity and could further exacerbate hunger in the region. The El Nino weather cycles have caused drought as well as flooding in parts of Africa in recent years. The possibility of drought currently threatens famine in countries ranging from Angola to Sudan, Mozambique to Madagascar. Nevertheless, it is conflict that poses an even greater threat of famine in countries such as Central African Republic, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Mali, and could cause or exacerbate famine should the fighting disrupt planting, harvesting cycles, and markets where locally produced food can be purchased. Ranking Member Bass and I, joined by Greg Simpkins, our Chief of Staff for the subcommittee, and Leslie Warner, who's on the full committee staff, just returned from a mission from South Sudan. Pierre Totsi, our Chief Counsel, was there in February, and I was in South Sudan 9 months ago in August of 2016. We found, both Ranking Member Bass and I and our delegation, that the situation is absolutely appalling. And again, it's absolutely preventable. Humanitarian aid officials repeatedly told us that no matter how much aid is provided, it will not be enough to meet the ever-expanding need, although we do have to provide as much as it takes as a bridge to help people who are suffering the potential of starvation. Although we need to do more, I would say, we have to really focus on ending the conflict and ending the impunity that has been practiced by many in the military in disrupting convoys and those who are trying to bring food and humanitarian assistance to people who are at grave risk. We heard and know that some 84 humanitarian aid workers in South Sudan have been killed. There's no other country on earth where so many women and men trying to assist their neighbors have been targeted for killing than in South Sudan. And when you add the rapes and all of the other terrible, terrible aggressions, it cries out for reform as quickly as possible. And that's what we weighed in with Salva Kiir, with his new defense minister, Jungo, who our hope is that he will take the country and the military into a professional way rather than, unfortunately, the way it has deteriorated. So that is our hope going forward. So before I obviously introduce our extraordinarily distinguished panel, I'd like to yield to Dr. Burra and members of the subcommittee for any comments they might have.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, and thank you for your tireless work to address suffering around the world. You know, folks might wonder, you know, why is this such an important issue to the United States? And I would just think back to my childhood, growing up in the 70s and 80s, and you know, sitting around the dinner table, you know, watching some of the footage and pictures of children and mothers starving in Ethiopia, in Somalia, and you know, some of that call to action. And you know, we've seen a repetition of that cycle over and over again in Africa. You know, as the chairman rightfully pointed out, you know, there certainly are climate causes to this, you know, in terms of, you know, significant droughts and so forth, but underlying that, there's the man-made causes as well, the violence, the disruption. And unless we dedicate the time and resources to dealing with these root cause issues, to working with the nations in Africa to develop the infrastructure, to build in the political systems, et cetera, to create stability and end this endless violent extremism and civil conflicts, we'll continue to see a repetition of the human suffering. So, you know, we had in full committee yesterday the Secretary of State talking about the State Department budget, and certainly one of my big concerns with the budget that's been put forth is the devastating cuts to our development funding. And you know, the repercussions if that budget were to go forward would change who we are as a nation and historically how we've engaged with the rest of the world. So, you know, in my remarks yesterday, as well as I'll reiterate my remarks today, we can't cut development like that because, one, that's not a reflection of who we are as a nation. I think America is a great nation, but a great nation leads with its moral values. It doesn't withdraw from the world when it sees suffering around the world. And you know, it is my hope as we start moving through the budget cycle, we're able to restore those development funds. We're able to keep the funding at a minimum where it's at, if not expand funding for aid around the world and development. And again, it's, you know, a world led by American values, those values of compassion, those values of trying to relieve the suffering around the world is a better world. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to yield my time. I have to attend something else that's starting at noon. I'll yield my time so the witnesses have more time to speak. Thank you.
I'll just say that so much of Africa is in not only crisis, but as this document I'm using from the Africa Center for Strategic Studies are facing emergencies and catastrophes as well. And these are short-term problems that we have to face right immediately because people are suffering so dramatically, but there's also long-term problems that are related to climate change and this battle in the world between stability and instability. And instability is growing throughout the world, and there's people that are trying to promote instability. And long-term strategies along the lines of what Dr. Barra was just talking about are essential. So thank you for the good work. This is an emergency that needs to be addressed, but there's also a long-term plan that we need to develop. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to now welcome our panel, beginning first. What an extraordinary honor it is to welcome Ambassador Tony Hall, former member, former chairman of the Hunger Committee, who has done more than just about anybody. I don't know anybody in Congress who has done more. I would put him right up there with the great Mickey Leland and Bill Emerson, who also co-chaired the Hunger Caucus in the past. But Tony has done it all. He's been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize 3 times, a leading advocate for hunger relief programs and improving human rights around the world. He serves as Executive Director Emeritus of the Alliance to End Hunger. He also leads the Alliance's engagement with the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Malnutrition. He served as United States Ambassador to the UN Agencies for Food and Agriculture in Rome, I remember visiting him there, which was just, again, no one had a better handle on what needed to be done and how to make it get done than Tony Hall. And then prior to his diplomatic service, Ambassador Hall represented the 3rd District of Ohio in the House of Representatives for 24 years. So, Tony, thank you again for your extraordinary leadership. We then will hear from Mr. Roger Thoreau, who joined the Chicago Council on Global Affairs as Senior Fellow of Global Food and Ag in January of 2010. And after 3 decades at the Wall Street Journal, for 20 years he was a foreign correspondent based in Europe and Africa. In 2003, he and his colleague wrote a series of stories on famine in Africa that was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in International Reporting. He's the author of several books on hunger, and his most recent book, The First 1,000 Days, A Crucial Time for Mothers and Children in the World, was published in May. I would point out that when Karen Bass and I met with President Museveni for what I thought was an extraordinarily important meeting of pushing him. He's very welcoming to the refugees, over 900,000. We gave him a copy of your book. And while Uganda has signed up with the United Nations for the effort to deal with that first 1,000 days with nutrition and supplementation, we said, you read this book and you will be the leader, Mr. President. So as I said to your staff and you, the more copies you give us, the more heads of state and health secretaries and everyone else will get a copy. Thank you for that, and thank you for your presentation to the ambassadors of Africa several weeks back. I really appreciate it. Then we'll hear in third, and thank you for being here as well, Mr. Julian Shop, Director of Humanitarian Practice at Interaction. In this capacity, he supports humanitarian emergency responses and contributes to the improvement of humanitarian practice on behalf of the network's members. He works on improving partnerships with UN agencies, overseeing country-specific working groups, and facilitating the development of clear advocacy positions on humanitarian issues. Before joining Interaction, Mr. Shop worked as a senior policy officer for the International Council of Voluntary Agencies, focusing on forced displacement issues. He has substantial field experiences and has worked in Ethiopia, the Ivory Coast, Uganda, Congo, Brazzaville, Sudan, and Chad, and again brings a wealth of experience that we need to benefit from here on this subcommittee. Ambassador Hall.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm really glad to be here with my 2 distinguished colleagues, and they have amazing backgrounds, and so it's great to share this table with them and associate with them and what they're going to say to you. In regard to yesterday, I'm so sorry what happened at the Ball Diamond. I'm very grateful that more congressmen didn't get hurt. Had to be an act of God that so many congressmen didn't get hurt. And I, being a former member of Congress for 24 years, I know so many people don't appreciate the time that you put in, the effort, and the effort that you give to the country. So I'm very appreciative of very thankful for your service. I also want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Congresswoman Bass, for your traveling to Uganda and to South Sudan. I think that is so important for members of Congress to travel. I know that you travel, Chris and Congresswoman Bass, because I've traveled with you, Chris, before when I was here, and it's so important to travel. And it's so important to see what's going on in the world, and because you vote on this. It's important to see it and to smell it and to walk around in it and to experience it, because when you come back here, you know, we're in the information age. I mean, there'll be, as I understand, every Congress has 20 to 30,000 bills and issues that come before it, and you can sit back here and try to understand it. But until you see it, feel it, walk around in it, you don't really understand it. And so thank you very much for going out to see it and witnessing these tragedies that we are seeing in this world today. You know, we've made tremendous progress in combating hunger in this world. In the past 30 years, we have cut, when I say we, the hunger community, the humanitarian community, we have cut hunger in half. And actually, I like to associate myself with it. I want to associate myself with it. We've actually cut poverty in half, which is amazing. I mean, these programs that you have backed and supported, they work. These food programs, these school feedings, this clean water programs, these sanitation programs, microcredit, microfinance, teaching women how to read and write, basic education. These work. And they have actually cut poverty and hunger in half. And I think that's amazing. 30 years ago, when I was here, I used to say, today, 42,000 people are going to die today from hunger and hunger-related deaths. Now, we say, today, 21,000 people are going to die today. I mean, that's still a lot of people, but that's a tremendous reduction, and these programs work. Now we find ourselves at a crossroads. Tens of millions of people in Africa and the Middle East, they're on the verge of starving to death. You saw it. Famine is something that is hard to truly comprehend unless you have seen it with your eyes. Mr. Barra, when you were probably a little boy, I was in the 1980s when I took my first trip. I went to Ethiopia and I saw 25 children die in about 15 minutes from that great famine. I was the first congressman to go to Ethiopia. I never got over it. Chris has heard me tell this story. And 10,000 people were up on a plateau in northern part of Ethiopia. And I was traveling with Mother Teresa's group, Sisters of Charity, and we were going to their clinic. The clinic was no bigger than this room, in the middle of nowhere, up near a place called Alamata. And these people were running, trying to get away from this civil war that was going on, and the drought turned into a famine, and it was a man-made kind of famine, pretty much similar to what we have today. And people just laid down, these 10,000 people, and died. And I walked through them to get to this clinic. They just, their mothers were handing me their dead children. They thought I was a doctor. They thought maybe I could revive them in some way. I still think about that I can't say every day, but a lot. I never got over that. 25 children in 15 minutes. These famines that we are facing today are man-made, and it was a failure of leadership that led to these crises. And it will take global leadership to respond. And this is not only because of the sense of moral responsibility, but frankly, saving lives makes strategic sense as well. My good friend David Beasley, he's the former governor of South Carolina. He's the new director of the World Food Program. He visited my organization, the Alliance to End Hunger, last week, and he came along with the FAO director, General Graziano da Silva, and David spoke frankly and convincingly about the importance for the United States to take the lead in responding to these famines. And he stated that where there is hunger, there is migration and extremism, and that food security programs are a powerful weapon against these forces. He even went as far to say that as a conservative Republican, he could, in all confidence, tell policymakers that funding for food security programs, both relief and development, could do more to prevent and combat extremism than many other measures the U.S. takes. You know, as I've seen this, as I've traveled, I can't tell you how many, and I've been to 130 nations in this world. Some of these nations, like Ethiopia, I've been to maybe 36 times. I can't tell you how many times people have come up to me because they know I'm a representative of the United States. and they'll say to me, thank you. I mean, these are the people that are starving. Thank you, thank you, thank you. The goodwill that the United States gets. You know, we put on, and you've seen this, we put on our bags, and we demanded this when we were in Congress 30 years ago. We put on our bags of food a flag of the United States, and in the language of the country that we're in, whether it's North Korea, which we used to feed, or it's Arabic, or whether it's Swahili, or whatever it is, in the language that that country is in, it says, donated by the people of the United States. The people never forget that. I'll never forget when I was ambassador in Rome. The President Berlusconi said, I think this was in 2002, he said, never forget about the Americans. Even when we weren't allies, he said, never forget what they did for us after the World War II, about the Marshall Plan. People don't forget. Just last week, Admiral Mike Mullen and General James Jones, they co-authored a piece in Politico that stated that in the 21st century, weapons and warfighters alone are insufficient to keep America secure. They went on to say that development assistance is a modern national security tool, and that cuts to U.S. aid would increase risk to Americans and to our brave military service members. This is something that many, if not all of us, generally agree on. Earlier this year, thanks to the leadership of members of Congress in this room, a budget was passed that provided nearly $1 billion in emergency famine relief. This follows last year's bipartisan support for the Global Food Security Act, which will help to provide critical development projects and funding. And this leads me to my next point. We cannot talk about addressing current famines without talking about how we prevent them in the future. We have said never again too many times. There have been troubling conversations and proposals recently around cutting and even eliminating much of our international development funding. There are some who argue that we should restrict development to those countries that provide strategic advantage to our defense and economic agendas. But I tell you this, if we choose to cut development, then we choose to disengage with a significant percentage of the world's population. This is not strategic. It's poorly informed short-sightedness. If we choose to scale back our development activities in the world, other countries should not be shy about stepping into the gaps. Last month, China's Xi Jinping, they pledged more than $100 billion for development projects in Asia, Europe, and Africa, adding poverty-focused programs and emergency aid to a list of infrastructure plans to link China more closely with the developing world. In an increasingly globalized world, with refugee situations and migration constantly in flux, the threat of extremism threatening our own citizens and our allies, there is no corner of the world that is not strategically important. We must end these famines now and bolster development that will both save and improve lives and livelihoods. The United States must continue to be the leader in global relief and development. Thank you.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for that, and again, for your leadership that has been lifelong. Mr. Thoreau.
Thank you, Ambassador Hofer. That was, very poignant and emotional comments, and reminding us again why we're all involved in this. And thank you, Chairman Smith and Ranking Member Bass, and the distinguished members of this committee for inviting me today to testify on this very important and extremely timely topic. And thank you for carrying the book halfway around the world. It's all part of our great effort to make the first 1,000 days a household phrase around the world, not only in those countries, but here in the United States as well, and the importance of that. So in order to respect the committee's time, my oral testimony will differ slightly from my longer written statement, which we submitted for the record. And also wanted to thank you for your steadfast support of agriculture development efforts,
for leading the way on the Global Food Security Act, Mr. Chairman, and now for raising the clamor about famine in your resolution and in this hearing, and for all the tremendous, hopefully good that comes out of the legislation on the global health legislation. And again, for raising the clamor on famine, that this medieval suffering continues today in the second decade of the 21st century is, I believe, the biggest stain on the world's conscience. I've witnessed famine and hunger crises, unfortunately, many times as a journalist. First as a foreign correspondent with the Wall Street Journal, and now as a senior fellow at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs and author of 3 books on hunger and malnutrition. My first travels in the hunger zones of Africa came during the Ethiopian famine of 2003, so nearly 2 decades after the one that Tony described, where we all linked our hands and said never again. And here we were back again in 2003 when about 14 million people were on the doorstep of starvation then. Upon arriving in the country, I met with the World Food Program workers who were scrambling to provide relief as the hunger spread. One of them gave me this piece of advice, which to me sounded like an ominous warning. Looking into the eyes of someone dying of hunger, he told me, becomes a disease of the soul. The next day, I stepped in an emergency feeding tent filled with dozens of starving children and their parents. And I looked into their empty, lifeless eyes. What I saw did indeed infect my soul like a disease. I saw mothers in misery, unable to stop the crying of a hungry child. I saw the resignation and defeat in the eyes of the farmers who had lost everything. I saw families on the move, abandoning homes and hope. I saw communities shattered, an entire generation, the children, vanishing in the arms of their parents. For me, it was impossible to see and not act, as I imagine it is for you, having just come back from the trip and the things that you've seen. What propels my writing, and I'm sure what propels your action, the action of everybody on this committee, is the firm conviction that things don't have to be this way. Yes, droughts will occur, conflicts will rage, corruption will complicate relief efforts, but starvation and famine can be avoided. Emergency responses of food aid and water and shelter and medicine are absolutely vital actions for sure, but they alone won't prevent the next famine. The next famine will only be prevented by long-term agriculture development investments, the investments that give farmers and their families resiliency against climate and economic shocks, that provide food security, that reduce conflict, that promote economic prosperity, and spread the hope of better futures. The kind of investments we've seen work pretty well under Feed the Future and the Global Food Security Act. So ending hunger wherever it may be is certainly the right, the moral thing to do. And that should motivate us all. But it is also the smart thing to do. For famine isn't just something that happens over there somewhere. Famine impacts all of us, no matter where it may be. The economic ripples of hunger and malnutrition are powerful and long-lasting. Even though a famine may end, the costs continue to accumulate and roll over time. We're told by the World Food Program that today about 5.4 million children are dangerously malnourished, and more than 1 million are at risk of starvation during these current famines. And that without sufficient and timely relief, up to 600,000 children are at risk of death in the coming months. That's shocking and unconscionable. But from my observation, the most pernicious impact of any hunger crisis, along with the lives lost, is what becomes of those who survive. The impact is greatest on women and children, particularly those that are in this first 1,000 days period, the time from the beginning of a mother's pregnancy to the second birthday of her child. Any lack of food, any bout of malnutrition during this time often leads to stunting, physically and cognitively. What stunting is a life sentence of underachievement and underperformance. Currently, in our world today, 1 in every 4 children under the age of 5 is stunted. 1 in every 4 children. The toll on the individual, the family, the community is profound in the loss of education and labor productivity over time. For a stunted child becomes a stunted adult. Collectively, this weakens our trading partners, and it limits our global opportunities. Childhood malnutrition and stunting can cost individual countries 8, 10, 12% of their annual GDP, according to the World Bank, which also estimates the cost to the global economy at about $3.5 trillion annually, in lost productivity, higher healthcare costs, and lessened trade. Those are big numbers. But perhaps the greatest cost of childhood malnutrition and stunting are immeasurable. A poem not written, a horizon not explored, an innovation not nurtured, a cure not discovered. What might a child have contributed to the world if he or she hadn't been stunted? For you see, a stunted child anywhere becomes a stunted child everywhere. So in closing, I just want to return briefly to Ethiopia and the 2003 famine. The first eyes that I looked into were those of a starving 5-year-old boy named Hagirso. The doctors and nurses and humanitarian relief workers were working extremely hard to save him and all the other dozens of children there. But they worried that Hagirso may not survive. What I saw that day has continued to haunt me. I've often wondered, well, whatever happened to Hagirso? So 10 years later, I returned to the scene of that awful famine. I was delighted to find that Hagirso had survived, but it was also clear he wasn't thriving. He was severely stunted. At 15 years old, he only came up to the bottom of my rib cage, physically stunted. And he had just begun attending first grade class, learning the alphabet at 15, cognitive stunting. Imagine, what might this child have accomplished were he not stunted? A lost chance at greatness for one child becomes a lost chance at greatness for all of us. That's what compels us to act today. This historical American imperative to lead the way to the end of hunger and malnutrition abides today stronger than ever before. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Bass, members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me here to testify. I do not have the impressive resume of my co-panelists, but hopefully I can bring here to this table some operational realities that my members of Interaction face on a day-to-day basis responding to those three famines. So first of all, I'd like to preface this testimony by clarifying that Interaction is not an operational organization itself, but an alliance of operational NGOs, many of whom work in these contexts. I'm, however, personally very familiar with these countries as I've come back from South Sudan, Nigeria, and Chad very recently. So as you've all said, it bears repeating that this is really an unprecedented crisis. I won't go into numbers again, but what I'd really like to underscore is that when we speak of famine in Nigeria, Somalia, and South Sudan, we're mostly speaking of avoidable man-made crises, because both state and non-state actors are putting civilians in harm's way, and possibly in some cases using hunger as a weapon of war. In that sense, it's very important to have an effective technical response to the food insecurity, but we also have to be aware that it's only a temporary reprieve. It has to be accompanied by robust diplomacy and commitments to respect the rules of war. I'll go now a little bit in the challenges of the humanitarian response. Access to those in need is paramount for effective humanitarian action. But our field staff face countless obstacles when they operate in those environments. Chairman, you've mentioned the numbers of aid workers killed in South Sudan, 84. That is more than in Syria or Afghanistan or Iraq that we maybe in our collective view see as much more dangerous. So put simply, the challenge lies in reaching the people where they are, mostly because of security, but also because of acts from the governments. In Nigeria, for instance, the military dictates the area where humanitarians can go, and we actually believe that the need is actually greater than what we actually know today. When new areas will be open, we fear that more need will be discovered in those. So host governments are also imposing undue obstacles on humanitarian actors and goods, obstructing and delaying much-needed humanitarian response. As an example, in South Sudan, the 2016 NGO Act has placed significant burdens on NGOs. We've recently faced challenges with work permits, slowdowns in visa processing, as well as import licenses.
And more importantly, travel is restricted for NGOs that try to reach central Unity State, where the famine has been declared. And that's really where the needs are. My second point will be on the need for a comprehensive response. It's worthy to remind ourselves that famine is not only providing food aid and nutrition assistance. By the time a famine is reached, people are suffering from malnutrition, they're weak, they're vulnerable to diseases and threats of abuses. And of course, children under the age of 5 are the most at risk. Furthermore, in each context, instances of sexual exploitation and abuse, forced recruitment, and gender-based violence are particularly acute. Women, especially, are subject to the predation of those in position of power and authority. The ones that actually provide the assistance can become the problematic actors in these instances. In Somalia, the increased household burdens placed on women and girls has led to negative coping strategies, including transactional sex and early marriage. So, as a consequence, I think the humanitarian response needs to be comprehensive, not only focus on nutrition and food aid, but look at a holistic picture, looking at health consequences, as was already said, and also protection intervention. How can we protect the most vulnerable in these communities? So the question is, what can the United States government do? We believe that the U.S. can take action to meet immediate and urgent needs and to remove obstacles that impede access to populations affected by famine. So the U.S. should strongly encourage parties to the conflict to respect the rules of war and guarantee that the affected populations have access to humanitarian assistance. Also, this in turn will make it less likely that aid is diverted and more costly. Also, the U.S. should consider granting humanitarian actors a clear and well understood general license from the Treasury Department to operate in areas that may be controlled by sanctioned entities, because that also is an issue for our members. The United States should use diplomatic levers to ensure that bureaucratic impediments are minimized so humanitarian actors and goods can get to the field in a timely and effective manner. The United States should also use flexible funding mechanisms to facilitate a rapid, effective, coordinated, and comprehensive humanitarian response. Again, we've talked about the need for food, shelter, water, and medicine that are essential, but also programs to prevent sexual exploitation, sexual violence, and forced recruitment. And within this, the U.S. should continue funding UN agencies like the World Food Program that have been already mentioned, but also beef up funding directly to NGOs that are at the forefront and on the front lines of these responses. So Congress, with the support of the chairman, the ranking member on this committee, provided $990 million to respond to these alarming food security crises. It's now also essential to ensure that these funds are allocated quickly and effectively in all these 3 countries before it's too late. So thank you again for the opportunity to address these operational challenges that humanitarian actors face. Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Bath, other members of the committee, you've demonstrated your leadership on this issue, and we count on you. Thank you.
Mr. Shep, thank you very much for your testimony and for the leadership of your organization. I would note for the record that we had thought of inviting a number of the NGOs that make up your very important coalition, but it's been my experience and the experience of many in this work that when they come and testify, when they speak candidly, as you have just done so well, there's often a retaliation in country. So I'll never forget during the famine in Ethiopia, Ambassador Hall, which you were there on the ground, first member of the U.S. House or Senate to be there, that there was a big, big meeting, and a lot of the NGOs did come. I was at that hearing. I actually chaired it for a while because it was a getaway day. A lot of people left. So I asked a series of questions about impaired access, fees. Mengistu, as we all remember, would not allow humanitarian corridors. It was also charging a per tonnage fee, same way that Salva Kiir now is doing on NGOs, which is outrageous. And Karen Bass and I really pressed him on that. How dare you charge the people that are feeding and clothing your people because of the war that you have promoted, and now you're charging them a fee to do that life-saving work. When I asked some very specific questions back during that famine, nobody wanted to answer out of fear of retaliation. So you put it all on the table in a very, 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 I think, succinct and persuasive way about, you know, the work permits, the visa denials, certainly the fees, and a whole lot of other impairments. So thank you for getting that on the record the way you have. All your members should be very happy with the way you have stood up for them. And I don't think there's fear of a retaliation because you've done it as the organizer, the unity aspect to all this. Let me just ask a few questions, and I'll yield to my good friend and colleague, Ms. Bath, and then to Mr. Garrett. You know, despite its visibility, Iraq and Syria, what could be more in the news than Iraq and Syria with all of the problems? Despite all of that, there has been a gross underfunding from the very beginning for the UNHCR, for the World Food Program, so much so that in 2015, I chaired a hearing, and we had the head of the regional representative of the UNHCR, the European Union. We had the Assistant Secretary for PRM, Population, Refugee, and Migration. And the UNHCR representative said, the reason for the mass exodus into Europe was the 30% cut in the World Food Program and the 40% only meeting of the obligations that UNHCR had done in their annual appeals. So 60% went unfunded, despite all the visibility. So Germany and all these other countries that got huge influxes of people, and you know that presents challenges, and it also presents opportunities. Had they provided sufficient humanitarian assistance, people might not have fled. They got to the point where they said, I give up. They're not going to help us. We need to vote with our feet. That is compounded exponentially by South Sudan and several African famines. And there we do have gross underfunding of world food. When Karen Bass and I and Greg were in the refugee camp in Bidi Bidi, despite the welcoming of the Ugandans for them, while we were there, they said a 50% cut in food rationing was under, and we saw that they were getting half of the corn because there wasn't enough in the kitty to I mean, I know Karen and I were both shocked, as was Greg. We came away and said, what? Who among us could live on about 1,000 calories per day? Everybody looked gaunt already, and it only will get worse. So again, to your point again, Ambassador Hall, about, you know, resourcing, you know, if the Europeans won't step up, we've got to make sure that we are. I'm encouraged that Mark Green it will be our new USAID administrator. He was on this subcommittee years ago, or my subcommittee of all things, but certainly his real expertise was developed as ambassador to Tanzania and other work that he did over the years. So we'll have a friend, and I think he will push hard, along with a few others, to make sure that we don't go below, but there needs to be a bridge, which means even more for this food aid and the like. So thanks for underscoring that, but we really, you know, this hearing is being held to be a catalyst hearing. We've reached out to Mike Pence already. I've talked to his chief of staff in follow-up to Karen and I's trip, gave him all kinds of information and said, if not us, who? These people are going to, wonderful people. We had conversations, remember that one little 15-year-old in Bidi Bidi camp, and, you know, eyes down, he looked stunted, sadly, you know, and you just, your heart breaks, because it doesn't have to be this way. It's a man-made problem. So I think the diplomatic surge, Mr. Schomp, that you referenced needs to be done. We have asked the administration, my question yesterday to Rex Tillerson, and both Karen and I, when we had breakfast last week, said, window of opportunity. We need to be on the phone to this guy, this president, I should say, Salva Kiir, and say, we mean business. And so my hope is that, you know, your testimony will further that going forward. So we will also hold a oversight hearing on the Global Food Security Act. We'll do it soon, and because that is a plan, it's a strategy. stresses resiliency and all kinds of other, is one good, Dr. Shah, the former USAID administrator, was brilliant in his leadership and helped us with that legislation, so I want to thank him. But now we need to see implementation. That's the key. So you've really covered just about everything, but I would ask one other thing, if I could just ask you to, August when I went there, I stressed with Salva Kiir that the Tehran compound and the humanitarian aid workers that were raped, including an attempted rape on a person from my own district who fought back, and when the troops came in to rescue, thankfully she had not been raped, but she was traumatized. I said to Salva Kiir, his defense secretary, and we said it again together in a joint voice, you need a zero-tolerance policy, President Salva Kiir, with your security forces and your military, no sexual assault, period. So the upcoming trial, which has already begun, should be a landmark, but not a one-and-done prosecution. They need to hold these soldiers to account for their exploitation that they have gotten away with impunity. And that was our message. You know, make sure this is done right, but it can't be over. There are so many indigenous South Sudanese women who have been raped and harassed and hurt, and of course, men and women who have been killed. Hold the perpetrators of that violence to account on an equal basis. And we did stress that when Karen and I met with the new Ajungo, the new chief of staff for the military, who we hope is a welcome breath of fresh air, and you might want to comment on that. But our takeaway, mine, and I hope yours was the same, that he said the right things, he was very articulate, and the era of Paul Malong hopefully is over forever. He is under house arrest. So they need to change. Our meeting with Salva Kiir was about almost 2 hours, would you say? And Ambassador McPhee, who's doing a wonderful job there, has been pressing these issues, and we just added additional bipartisan. To your point, Ambassador Hall, about the United States of America, we were at a warehouse where there was enough food to feed 400,000 people. This was in Bentu Camp in Unity State for how many months? A month, but 400,000 people, all courtesy of us, and that was great to see. But we did meet with a member of our embassy who, just as you said, Mr. Ambassador, the thanks is long-lasting. He got into this work because 30 years ago, he was in the same situation about 30 years ago, as a refugee, and remembers the generosity of the American people, and now he's giving back ever since to help others who are similarly situated. So questions more of the fees, we got to fight those. We did raise it jointly, very aggressively, I thought, and we'll just keep, hopefully something comes out of it, Ms. Bass. Unless you want to comment, and then I'll go to Mr. Garrett.
I don't have much to say because I think you answered so many of the questions that I thought might come to us, and you answered it in such a positive way. I mean, we're very thankful to both of you for the way that you supported the famine relief bill, the $1 billion, almost $1 billion. I mean, that was tremendous, and that is a shot in the arm to the famine victims. What the anti-hunger community is worried about, I mean, this is their number one worry, is with the budget for 2018.
Right.
They're worried because, as you know, they have zeroed out many of not only the food programs, but they zeroed out almost the whole development program under AID. And all the things that we have made such progress in, cutting hunger in half, cutting poverty in half, would just absolutely stop and reverse everything that's going on. We're very worried about that, and it scares us because we know all of the good work that you did with that $1 billion would stop at the end of the year, at the end of this fiscal year, and so that scares us, and that would absolutely cause all these people, at the end of October to start I mean, they would die in alarming numbers, because what the United States does, we're the leader. And what we do, every other nation follows us. So if we cut, everybody else is going to cut. And that'll just be a disaster.
Well, you know, I think the good news is that when we did have the hearing on the budget, there really wasn't support. I mean, on bipartisan, Democrats and Republicans were all rejected the cuts. And so I think that's very helpful. Now, on the other hand, I'm a little concerned, and I'm not sure how you feel about this, Mr. Smith, but we had a Tillerson, you know, at Foreign Affairs yesterday, and I'm just a little concerned about whether or not that money has hit the streets, when it's going to hit the streets, and if it's held up, whether then it will be carried over into the next year. And we don't want to see this carried over. We need additional funds. And so I really think that's where you all come in, because for us to know when exactly it hits, or if it's being held up, we need for you guys to communicate to us that the money has not been received, it's not gotten there. But so I think we need to be, you know, on the alert for that. So I wanted to ask a few questions of each of you, and really appreciate you taking your time out for being here, and just also very much appreciate all of your work over the years. So you mentioned the Global Food Security Act, and Mr. Thoreau, you wrote a blog a few years ago that said common sense had long ago left the U.S. food aid system. And so I wanted to know, you know, given that we have taken a step forward in the right direction, if you think there's further modifications that you would recommend that Congress consider. You know, I was encouraged. I will tell you that when we were passing the bill, I received a lot of pushback from my Democratic colleagues, because they were concerned that if you purchase food locally, that there wouldn't be that message that you spoke about, a gift from the American people. So I was happy when I was in South Sudan. I saw the differences in the bags. So this is locally purchased. It says a product of Uganda, but it does say it's a gift of the American people, along with this is food that we actually shipped. So we took a step in the right direction. And how much further, what more would you recommend we do? And I'd like to ask that of both Ambassador Hall and Mr. Thoreau.
Yeah, thanks for that. And yeah, I was trying to think and was talking with my colleagues about, what have I written in the past on this?
That was one.
To be consistent. No, exactly. I was back and reading the first book, and things that come basically out of what we saw during the famine of Ethiopia of 2003. And I think it was kind of coming out of there where this whole need for some kind of reform, of greater efficiency to our U.S. food aid system was emerging. Because I remember having discussions then, and my colleague at the Wall Street Journal, Scott Kilman at the time, and speaking with Andrew Natsios, who was the USAID administrator there. And he felt at that time, you know, that he himself needed more flexibility to address that famine on the ground. The food wasn't getting there quick enough, that he thought. USAID had calculated that it might, you know, through some kind of cash component, if the food got there cheaper, was there quicker, also provides an incentive to the local farmers and the markets there that here's some purchasing action coming in, that an additional, I think it was back then, 50,000 lives or so could be achieved. And so if that's the goal and that's what one's looking for, I think continuing with the efforts that we've seen on kind of adjusting and reforming the food aid to make it as efficient as possible, kind of in whatever kind of construct that it is, but that we want to feed as many people as possible, you know, and as quickly as possible, and as cheaply as possible. And I think that the U.S. administration, Congress, the people on the ground, to have as many options and as many tools available to be able to achieve that, I think is what really needs to happen. So I'd say, yeah, continuing with the efforts to make it more efficient, to save more lives, and to have this flexibility and this variety of options and tools there for people to actually be able to deploy I think would be a great need. And you can kind of see the progress then that has been kind of evolutionary since the 2003 famine in Ethiopia.
Thank you. Ambassador Hall?
If we can buy the food locally, it's a good idea to buy it locally because it's much less expensive and it helps the farmers.
Right.
It's a good deal. Oftentimes, a lot of people say, oh, let's buy the food locally. We can't buy the food locally sometimes. I remember this problem we had when I was ambassador in Rome, and we had this tremendous drought in South Africa, and all the ambassadors in Europe, they were pushing, oh, let's buy the food locally, let's buy the food locally. We couldn't buy the food locally because that's where the drought was.
Yeah, but doesn't locally mean within the region? I mean, it doesn't have to mean down the street.
We couldn't buy it in the region, so we had to ship.
Somewhere in Africa?
We couldn't, I mean, the whole region of South Africa didn't have enough food for us to buy. So we had to bring food in from America, which was fine. But the European ambassadors were up in arms because we were bringing in GMO foods. And I personally support GMO foods, but there's nothing wrong with it. But that raised a whole other problem.
Right.
And so you can't always buy
Right.
local foods.
Right.
That's the first thing. So if we can buy local foods, that's great. Secondly, school feeding is really great. If we could do school feeding, you get not only the boys in there, you get the girls. And when you do that, it's one less meal that the farmers have to feed. If you do vaccinations, if you teach the mothers how to read and write, if you do microcredit, if you do clean water, you do those 4 or 5 things, you will change the country
Well, those are
overnight.
Those are things that I would classify, and maybe you would or maybe you wouldn't, as helping to build the resilience of communities. I mean, it's one thing to address the famine. My concern is that we're going to have this big effort this year, and 12 months from now, because the underlying problems haven't been solved, we'll be right back. We might not have a drought, but, the conflicts will be carrying on. So were you describing resiliency type programs?
I'm describing the resiliency. We have to feed them first.
Right.
You've got to save their lives. You must answer the famine. If you don't do that, they will die, and we have to keep that up. And what you have to be aware of is you got to be aware of the bureaucracy of the UN system and the bureaucracy of the countries, whether it's the United States bureaucracy or
Right.
it's the European bureaucracy, because they'll kill you. And if you don't have that money in the system, and if you don't push that system, we'll wake up all of a sudden, and, in January, February, we'll say, what the heck happened? So it's incumbent not only on us, the anti-hunger community, it's incumbent upon the congressman to push that money that you passed, that is pushed out into the system, that money is used to buy the food, whether it's local or here
Right.
in the United States, and get out there to those countries where it's needed.
And my request to you all is that you help us with that in terms of, letting us know.
We will do that, but you also have to use your power.
Absolutely.
Because when a congressman or a senator calls the bureaucracy and says, what the heck is going on,
Yeah.
they get excited.
Yes, but
They get nervous.
I guess the point I was making is for you to assist us in terms of when to make that call. Because as we move on, we won't necessarily follow, the money trail. You raised several issues that I wanted to, you mentioned Nigeria dictates where we can go. So that was a concern to me, because I'm wondering, does that mean that you can't get to where you need to go? And I know that situation in South Sudan. Now, one of the things, as Mr. Smith raised when we were there, we were very, very strong on the fees, because the fees had been $10,000 and then it was lowered to $3,500, and I think that was supposed to be okay, but it wasn't. And so we pressed very hard that they not do that. And so then the question, are they doing that? what happened. You also mentioned funding directly to NGOs, and so my question is, well, what happens now? Where does the money go? Is there intermediaries before it gets to your member organizations? So hopefully you got all those.
Okay, so thank you. In terms of the question on Nigeria and the army telling us where to go, the first instance is of course a security concern.
Sure.
Boko Haram is of course not very friendly to our activities, and there is this desire to protect and not have incidents happen as they are conducting their counterinsurgency operations. At the same time, we do believe that they're trying to hide is maybe not the correct word, but to do some cleanup away from the eyes of the international community. And so the issues around access, the issue around the way that the counterinsurgency operations are conducted, because we've heard of a number of reports of human rights violations as
Right.
those were happening, I think is of concern. So that's about that. In terms of the fees, I think the fear that we have is thank you really for raising this issue forcefully with the government of South Sudan. Sometimes the chain of command between the top and the local representative or the representative of this minister or this minister, it's not happening very well, and therefore each bureaucrat, if you will, either
Well, is that what that
honestly-
is, or is that corruption?
I wouldn't use the word corruption necessarily. It's there's rent seeking. There's rent seeking at all levels of the South Sudanese government, and it's so I wouldn't call it corruption directly, but it's trying to get some resources where they are, and in such a resource poor country, as you know, there's NGOs represent a source of resources. Regarding direct funding to NGOs, I mean, it sometimes gets lost within the big system response. I think there needs to be a little bit more analysis on who is on the ground and who can provide the assistance.
Well, is it
the
an
best.
intermediary that funds your member organizations, or?
I think there's really different models. Some money comes through UN agencies, in which case then there is a bureaucratic slowdown, but at the same time it allows for coordination and harmonization. So we just have to make sure the money goes quickly. And in other cases, it's just not going sufficiently to NGOs. Sometimes it's not really the case necessarily for the US government, but for other governments that have less means to program their money, they'll just sign a big check and it gets lost. So really getting more analysis done on how can we reach the beneficiaries the best way, who are the best organizations, which requires a little bit more work.
So is that, you also mentioned removing obstacles, so is that what you're describing?
Well, the obstacles are more the impediments around fees, around different types of the visas. In Nigeria, there were a lot of issues around visas. In Somalia, some access to airstrips and things like that that are off limits. I think for us, money is the first priority. The second one is access to the people, and this is where security, bureaucratic impediments come and prevent us from responding as well as we're ready to.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. One thing before I yield back my time is after we came back last week, I went with Representative Lee, and we went to New York and visited a couple of the missions, the UN missions. And I am concerned about the European response because, everybody seemed as though they understood and that they were going to weigh in, but at the level of which they were going to contribute was of major concern, $7, $8, $9 million. And so I also think we need to pay attention to that. And I believe there's a donor conference that's coming up soon, I think in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Oftentimes, they have these pledge conferences in New York and oftentimes in Rome because the big humanitarian organizations are really in Rome through the World Food Program, FAO. And those are the conferences where these countries really need to be put on the spot, because, you know, they give these flowing speeches, and then they like to blame the United States. You guys don't do enough. And like you say, the United States will come up with $1 billion, and they'll say, and then they'll give a wonderful speech, and they say, well, we'll give 8 or 9 million. And it drives you crazy. And so we,
Who follows up? I
we
mean, they
we push them very, very hard, and we try to embarrass them to give a lot more money. And it just, it's very frustrating sometimes. And I think when you travel like you do, you and the chairman, I think it's very, very important to really point that out, to even write about it sometimes in publicity and stuff like that, that oftentimes a lot of the countries do a lot of talking, but they don't produce. And I used to sit in those pledging conferences, and it would surprise you of the money, of the speeches that they would give, and the lack of money that would back it up.
I was just going to say, I think there's also a short-sightedness, certainly, to their response and their contributions. And then to kind of also hammer home, and I'm sure everybody does this, and as a journalist writing about these things, why it's in their interest, in the Europeans' interest, to be involved in this. As you were talking about, the number of refugees then that have flooded into Europe because of, that's their first stop, is they're fleeing hunger, they're fleeing poverty, they're fleeing conflict. That's where they're ending up first, and that a lot of this could be prevented if they are more proactive in saying, let's do what we can to resolve these issues so all these people stay where they are, because that's what those people want to do as well. They don't want to have to flee. And so that's where the whole resiliency comes in. They have no option. What are they going to do? So they go. And that's their first stop. And so it's their self-interest. Thank you.
Shoot.
Just to
Sorry.
add one word, I think we need to ask more of the Europeans, but also of the global community, because in general, the humanitarian needs, if you look at the global picture, is growing in terms of dollar amounts and number of people that need to be assisted. So we need to talk more to the Gulf countries, to talk more to China, to talk more to non-traditional donors, because at some point it's not going to be possible for the US or Europe to continue carrying that load, and it's part of our responsibility to work with them.
Thank you, Congresswoman Bass. Some observations laced with questions. There are entities who we certainly could appreciate seeing more done by, who will only export food aid when they export ideology, and that, I think, becomes problematic. And I think we need to discourage that. I commend all members of the panel. I'm an interesting thinker, and what I've written on my flowchart is that food equals stability, stability facilitates education, education facilitates development, and development facilitates peace. We don't want to create a perpetual state of foreign aid sustaining populations and nations. We want to create a circumstance where nations can sustain themselves, to paraphrase a book I once read parts of, Teach a Man to Fish. And so that's the goal. The one point that I've heard made that turned the light bulb on for me to get to that end, that stability via food, facilitating education, which facilitates development. The stunting testimony, by the way, was compelling, which would facilitate peace and then more stability, was the school feeding. And so to the extent that that's a paradigm that we need to learn more and foster, I think it should be encouraged. And I also think that given the fact that ideology is optional, but food is necessary, that your school feeding creates a paradigm wherein young women might have access to opportunities. And I think you pointed that out, but by virtue of some of the events in some of the regions of Africa that we're discussing, I would welcome more input on how we foster programs like that. The other point that I want to make and open the floor to you all to speak to is that you have this sort of self-perpetuating cycle that's not stability, education, development, peace, but instead lawlessness, hopelessness, and then displacement, and ultimately where there's hopelessness, radicalization. And if we can't, right? I mean, I guess what I'm not saying very well is very rarely do you see a young woman or man who's aspiring to be a doctor or a teacher commit an act of radical violence. It's only where hopelessness has manifested itself in a community, which usually occurs where there's lawlessness, where a vacuum is filled by someone who's a strong man, usually, who visits violence to control a community. So I guess what I'm driving at is that we need to sell to people the peace dividend of food, right? And so again, I would invite comment on that, but I think to the extent that we can show that where that works, that we'll have a harder time selling our colleagues, or an easier time selling our colleagues on the expenditure. Where have we seen stability as a result of feeding and education and development as a paradigm moving forward? It's amazing for me, having visited with refugees in Europe at my insistence, that Europe doesn't see the upside to the investment. It blows my mind. And I've often argued that the one thing that and then we'll talk about Syria, I'll jump out of Africa for a moment, but the one thing that 6 million displaced people have in common is they don't want to be displaced. So if you can help people where they are and create opportunity where they are, but again, it's not ultimately about just sending food. It's about creating a circumstance where ultimately they can lift themselves up and feed themselves. Which brings, I'm sorry for the soliloquy, but gosh, they gave me the gavel, we're all in trouble. Which brings to mind Ethiopia, which is an amazing situation, because while we've seen some economic development, particularly by percentage, impressive on a world stage, and I challenge the folks in the audience today to pull out their cell phones and Google Ethiopia population density and Ethiopia rainfall, and then compare Ethiopia's 270 persons per square mile, and then divide that or multiply by 2, because about half of Ethiopia is virtually uninhabitable, to the United States is 91 or Russia's 22. And so what we have now is a circumstance where if we don't get education and we don't see continued growth on the pace that Ethiopia is growing, which is improbable because they've exploded, although the people at the bottom haven't gotten the memo, it's unsustainable, right? I mean, tell me otherwise. So we have to get that education component in, and it becomes an ultimate chicken and egg game. So I would ask you all to help us speak to our colleagues in a language they can understand, and I'll look to to the doctor and say, you're right, what appeals to a member of my party might be, hey, we can stem global radicalization by virtue of feeding. And what appeals to a member of another party might be something else, but we're all working towards the same end, which is peace and stability. So maybe talking points on how to sell this. I would hate to see what is a tiny percentage of the discretionary budget axed by virtue of people who I think are rightly fiscally conservative because they don't understand just how darn much good this does. So I guess I'm asking for help with messaging and maybe any guidance you all could give.
Well, you make a lot of good points, and you ask a lot of good questions. I think the first issue I'd like to talk about is school feeding. And school feeding is really important because, especially in these developing nations that are extremely poor, most of these kids, they don't get proper nutrition at home. And they're lucky if they get one good meal a day. We fortify the food oftentimes at the schools, and they get the vitamins and minerals that they need. I mean, and these are really well fortified meals. And oftentimes what happens is that the fathers, they have to keep their children home to work in the fields, but they can't really afford to feed them. And so it's very, very difficult. But when you tell the father and the mother that we will feed them in schools, they will send them to schools, and we give them enough food, enough fortified food in those schools, and they will send the daughters, which often in a lot of countries they don't do, but because we feed both of them, I mean that is really something that they go for. So it's school feeding really, really works, and it's very.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. Where are we doing this now? What countries are we?
We're doing it in almost all of these countries. Where we have a problem is where we have civil war it's very difficult to do it. You know, we don't necessarily do it in countries where there's civil war, but we do it. We do it in, of course, all the Feed the Future countries, which are 19 countries, most of which are in Africa. So we do it in a lot of the countries, and it really works. The second thing you ask about is that, you know, where there is hunger, you know, when people are hungry, especially a young man, you'll do anything to eat. And you put a gun in somebody's hand, and he will use that gun. He will figure out a way to get food. And, you know, when you're hungry and you put a gun in somebody's hand, you got a security problem. And that's when, you know, so feeding somebody and school feeding is really a security problem. I mean, when people are hungry, you can, I mean, the chances of recruiting terrorists are pretty good. It's pretty easy to recruit them. It's a real security problem. The third thing you ask about is that education. And one of the things that we have found out is that a very simple thing of teaching mothers how to read and write is one of the best things that we can do. When you teach mothers how to read and write, the population of the country goes down. The birth rate drops, and the malnutrition goes down, and the gross national product goes up in the country. We found that through hearings when we had the Select Committee on Hunger. That is an amazing statistic, because the women, they not only get smart, they realize they don't have to have as many children. They start to understand what it is to boil water, what it is about nutritious foods. They understand about breastfeeding, and they start to think, you know, I know how to make a little bit of money now. I mean, you start to give them loans, small loans. They pay it back with interest, microcredit, and all of a sudden they start hiring a few people, and the gross national product of the country goes up. And microcredit and education of the mothers is one of the smartest things you can do. You start doing those 3 or 4 things in a country, and you will see the country improve by leaps and bounds within 10 years.
Yeah, I'm just thinking out loud. I really appreciate your testimony, and I really think I've learned a lot today. I think it'd be an interesting exercise to look at U.S. military expenditure by nation in Africa versus food expenditure, and because again, it's about ROI. I'm a budget hawk. We have a problem as a nation with spending, but just because we need to make cuts doesn't mean we need to cut everything. So I think the way to sell the right thing to do, which I think what hunger relief that you're advocating for is on multiple levels, because it's a humanitarian thing to do, because it's a national security interest, because we want to see stability and prosperity so that we can continue to thrive and prosper as a global marketplace. But you got to show the ROI to the reluctant, to the skeptic, and say this money will save money and lives on the front end and the back end. So.
The other thing too is a lot of them are eating the very food that our farmers have grown. That's not a bad deal either.
Right. And there is more and more economic analysis on the ROI points, but then also the benefits of food aid, of the global health efforts, of these efforts on the 1,000 days. And so that's what makes this point that, you know, and we all agree, all these things are the right thing to do and the moral thing to do, and that's why we should do them. There's the security aspects of it, there's the security reasons to do it, but it's also that this is just such essentially the smart thing to do economically. And in terms of talking points, Congressman, what you had said kind of earlier at the outset, even before the testimony began, global health is American health.
Yeah.
Global prosperity is American prosperity. Global well-being is American well-being. And so that's why what happens on the hunger front, on the nutrition front, on the ending famine front in Africa is so vitally for here, because none of these problems, the problems of hunger and malnutrition, there's no kind of sequestering that or putting a wall around any of that, because it seeps over time and over over space. And the whole thing about, you know, the youth and this huge youth bulge that we see in Africa and in other countries, in places like India. They're looking for, and we're also then looking for from them, this demographic dividend that comes from that. But the hunger, the malnutrition, particularly in this 1,000 days period, if all these children that are there are getting off to such a lousy start in life and then are sentenced to this life sentence of underachievement and underperformance, basically by the time they're 2 or 3 years old, that demographic dividend becomes a demographic disaster, not only for those countries but for all of us.
Mr. Schwab, am I saying it right? Am I saying your name right?
You're saying it perfectly right. Thank you.
Will the miracles never cease?
I don't have much to add, just to agree that to some extent all these cases, be it hunger, be it radicalization, all you want to call it, are the result of development failures and of governance failures. So if we address these issues, there is a return on investment that comes at the end of the day, because you don't need to invest in mitigating measures, be they humanitarian or others, further down the line. So I think we have to see a long term, and we have to have humanitarian and development actors work closer together.
Very quickly, how can the U.S. government, and rendering assistance, and I know that the budget for school feeding is zeroed on paper, I hope we can change that, but how can the U.S. government, in working with private entities, maximize output? Give me some examples of what can be done or what is being done to get the greatest, again, ROI, for lack of a better term, with some of the entities like the ones with whom you work. What can we do better? What's being done well?
I was going to say, I mean, one example that's I think's been zeroed out is the McGovern-Dole feeding program. All the things that Tony was talking about, and the incentive to get the children into school if the food is there, one, feeding them, but then also the education, that comes from that. And I've seen that program, and then also school feeding in the U.S., in terms of a number of countries, where school feeding is on the ground. It's been a number of countries, and particularly of Africa, where I've seen that. You really do see the impact of that in terms of the health of the children, the education of the children, and then the well-being of the communities that comes from that as well. So
The other thing, they have completely zeroed out the whole development budget for AID. I mean, how can you, development program, that's what we've been talking about here for, the past hour, is development programs. Yes, we've got to help with the famine, you've got to help people live, but if you don't have development programs like school feeding, like teaching mothers how to read and write, like microcredit, you can't help these people get on their feet. And it's zeroed out. It's like zero. They didn't leave anything in there. So, yeah.
I would offer Mr. Barra the floor for any comments or questions he might have, and thank you, gentlemen, for your testimony.
Great, very quickly, since those bells going off are votes getting called. So we've got a few votes, but I think this is pretty fascinating. If I think about the crisis that we're about to face, we're not looking at one famine, we're looking at potentially 4 famines simultaneously. And, as I talked about, my childhood watching some of these horrific pictures, we've got the short-term challenge, right? The relief of suffering and so forth. But then, I think we've got to look beyond that. So we don't have this cycle of repetition and look at some of the long-term stability. How do we create stable political structures in some of these countries? How do we make those investments, Ambassador Hall, that you were talking about in terms of school lunch programs, in terms of educating mothers, continued investment in maternal child health, continued investment in family planning, which may not necessarily, as you already pointed out, be the political divide that sometimes we get into here, but family planning could be education, right, and empowerment, and as a way of reducing birth rates. So, I know we're running out of time here, but I'd love to follow up and have that conversation, because really when you do look at our foreign aid budget and where we make those investments, we may not be making the right investments for long-term stability, to get the right return on those investments. So we'll reach out and, I'd love to have a longer conversation, and also love to work with Mr. Garrett on thinking about how we build some of those structures, because again, I don't think this is a bipartisan issue when you're thinking about how you address and create long-term stability and infrastructure. That's not only in the interest of the countries, it's in our interest as well. So thank you.
I'll just say real quickly, you've already started your long-term programs through one of the best programs I've seen here in the last 5 years is Feed the Future. You've started it. It's a tremendous investment in agriculture, because agriculture is 80% of all the workers in these developing nations is in agriculture area, and you've started it. I mean, and that really is working. It's an investment in research, it's an investment in seeds, it's an investment of the right type of agriculture, and it's really working. And that really is an investment in the future.
Gentlemen, I thank you, and I thank those in attendance. Dr. Barra, unfortunately, they've called the votes. We get about 7 or 8 minutes on the clock, so we're going to adjourn, and I thank you again.
Thank you, sir.